Welcome to the History of California podcast. I'm your host, Jordan Mattox. Today we have Dr. William Deverell on the show. Dr. Deverell is a professor of history, spatial sciences, and environmental studies at USC. He's an American historian with a focus on the 19th and 20th century American West. He has written works on political, social, ethnic, and environmental history, and is the founding director of the Huntington USC Institute on California in the West. This was so much fun to record. Bill has written books across an array of areas and subjects. We just had a great time exploring different facets of California history. We cover a broad range of subjects. We do spend time on his most recent book on Kathy Fiscus, which is a fascinating story about reality television and its origins. But more broadly, this is just a podcast about California history at large. And there's a lot to be learned through this conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Let's go meet Dr. William Deverell. You've written so much about California history. So before we dig into the details, I thought it'd be fruitful to take a wide lens. How has, in your view, the writing of California history evolved over your career?
It's a great question. And in my career, I would say some of the prominent changes or swings have been an increased attention to social history and to the sheer diversity of experiences in California. Of course, I've seen in my career more work on the latter 20th century as we moved through it. There had been a kind of fixation in the old days on 19th century California wrapped around either the transition from the Mexican to the American period or the gold rush or the Gilded Age and Railroad era. So the 20th century began to exercise its fascination to historians. So those are some of the big changes.
Got it. Do you think the history of a city like Los Angeles or San Francisco has more in common with, let's say, the history of New York than the history of a place like Bakersfield?
What an interesting question. I think there are ways in which metropolitanization can be generalized across some experiences, at least in the United States, with infrastructure, demographic change, business growth, et cetera. However, I still like to think there's a California out there that holds a lot of places together, regardless of their size and history. So I think it's probably both.
Okay. One of the things that's often said about California is it's a progressive paradise. It's in a place where they're experimenting with the most progressive forms of politics. And so I think people project that onto the past, but we both know that California history is much more complicated. So would you say that kind of mythology of California holds through in the history of the state, or is that a recent development?
You put your finger on something that we both know, and I think your listenership knows, is that California lends itself to mythologies. California lends itself to even the notion of a California dream is itself a kind of fantastic construction of a myth. And so that reading back into the past about what does or doesn't California stand for or mean, I do think it's laden with mythology. So we have to strip that away as scholars, and we have to fend off nostalgia. So I do think it's complicated if you say California has always been this or always been that. It depends on when you are, where you are, and who you're talking about, because California is, of course, endlessly, fascinatingly complex.
What do you think the state of regional history is? I know it's less trendy in academia. You're pigeonholed in continental regions, or intranational, or transnational is another one of all these kind of terms. But being a strictly California historian maybe doesn't hold the same weight as some of those kind of bigger kind of categories. Is that more to do with grad school and how people specialize, or is that some kind of status issue between different forms of history?
It's probably all those strands. Those of us that focus predominantly on California have to pay attention to the broader American West geographies and histories. And that includes now increasingly the Trans-Pacific, the borderlands, the Republic of Mexico, even Canada. So you can focus in with a kind of regional specificity, but if you do that without any attention to the historical strands that connect you to regions and geographies well beyond your focus, you're missing a broader context that's hugely important. So I think we both historians that are really changing the field have breadth and depth.
Let's say you're a person and your only exposure to reading about California history is Kevin Starr. How do you think that will paint your picture, and what are the potential gaps there for someone that relies on that as their only source?
I knew Kevin, he was a mentor figure. I miss him. His loss is real. He tackled the history of California and its culture in ways that no one has before. And so his mountain of work has certainly shaped a lot of perceptions about California. It's written in a kind of grandiose style. It's written in a kind of older narrative style that is marked by a lot of great and talented historians from the 19th century forward. It's not as social historically defined or refined as a lot of other books, but Kevin was trying to get the kind of 30,000-foot view decade to decade. In that ambition, I think he did it. However, there are, of course, gaps in the ways in which he went about it. And his notion that drove him was to both scold California for not living up to the dream and also try to define and redefine the dream decade to decade. That's an ambitious thing to do, but I think in many respects, what he did would be nearly impossible for a scholar to take on now.
Amongst the various variables that one has to try and understand the history of a region, do you think there's any more important than water to understand California's history?
Good question. I think you can't do much better than water and its history as a central point of investigating California. But increasingly, I think scholars who are paying attention to environmental issues such as water and aridity and water infrastructure have to pay attention to other elements, fire, climate change, drought, etc., to make their stories richer and deeper. So you can do water and tell us a lot about the growth of California, the infrastructural and engineering history of the place. But increasingly, that's all woven into the fact that, as John Muir reminded us a long time ago, everything's connected.
Yeah. When I talk about California with people, I often describe it as a pendulum, and there's a constant swing between Silicon Valley and Hollywood in terms of centering the state. I also often say that the Central Valley, as a resident, is the sleeping giant that's right next to those places that will awake someday and really dominate California. But for you, which region has really defined the state more thoroughly, Silicon Valley or the Hollywood region?
I guess I'll take the historian's easy route here, which is it depends on when you're talking. And so Gold Rush era Sierra Nevada and the rise of San Francisco and Sacramento, fundamental, totally fundamental. By the end of the 19th century, the awakening of Southern California through the booster ethos, through the demographic expansion, the explosion, the arrival of Hollywood, aviation, oil, the oil industry, Southern California roars into importance with exclamation points. The pendulum is a good way to think about it. I agree with you, but they're always connected. For instance, if you look at the rise of Silicon Valley and the chip industry, those chips are initially being sold to aerospace industries down here in Southern California. They're not in the personal computers, they're not invented yet. And the connective tissue in the political economy and the technology and the fiscal arrangement is always fundamental. And a lot of that is venture capital, other things pass through or root in the Central Valley through agricultural production, cotton, et cetera. So it's all connected, but I do think they wax and wane in terms of significance and the ways in which the world thinks of the place. So the world probably has a sort of schizophrenic vision of California. They're probably as pulled to the technological centrality of the Silicon Valley. At the same time, they're thinking about Hollywood and the film industry.
Previous guest to the show, Malcolm Harris, wrote a book called Palo Alto. Have you happened to read that book? Do you have any thoughts on it?
I have not read it. I'm interested in it as a Stanford graduate who spent quite a bit of time in Palo Alto, but I have to admit I haven't read it.
Okay. It's a rich book, an incredible. I forget what those things called that hold other books up because it has some
Oh,
girth to it. But I'd
wow.
recommend it, and I think it would be an interesting addition to this discussion. Let's
No
go on to the
question. Yeah.
next question. Let's talk a little bit more about the historical writing of California. Is there are there distinct approaches to writing about California relative to other historical subjects?
I guess in some respects, there is a genre of writing about California as an exceptional place. And as an historian, I get a little worried about that because California is the product of people's imaginations who come here from everywhere else in the world. And so it's connected, and its exceptionalism can sometimes roll over into hubris and arrogance about the place. But there is certainly that genre. There's a genre of writing about California by some of the most ambitious writers to just try to get their arms and heads around a place so vast and historically and demographically complex. That would be true of trying to write about other places too, but the scale of California is breathtaking.
Yeah.
So there is that. There's a wryness to certain writing about California that I think is a combination of let's take the dream seriously, but we're going to show you how the dream is itself flawed. And so we have a fair amount about Carey McWilliams is probably the best at that.
Yeah.
We still admire Carey McWilliams decades after he wrote and got his head around California. And then there's the minute work, the really micro-historical work of a place, a moment. And some of that work is the most exciting, I think, because it takes us into geographies, regions, and even neighborhoods about California that we know in our mind's eye are there. We haven't had many people write about them. So there is a fluorescence these days. There's a book called Writing Literary California. There's a new book by Angel City Press that has these little crystalline little essays about place. And that's exciting.
Yeah. What do you think is the biggest lacuna or gap in subject matter about California history? What do you wish there was more books, publications about in the state that maybe is undercovered that people should know about or understand?
In some ways, the easy answer is everything that's not 20 miles from the Pacific coast. You
Yeah.
know that.
Yeah.
So the dominance of a kind of coastal California has slanted our understanding towards
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
West.
Mm-hmm.
There is a lot of California that is not that. By the same token, Northern California, above San Francisco, above the Bay Area, above the Napa Valley, we need to know a lot more about that. And then just tackling the environmental complexity of California in this era, we need a lot more scholarship on that too.
Gotcha. What do you think? Are there any, and it's hard to trace this, what do you think is the biggest residual impact of the gold rush on California today? Just in terms of how it continues to shape us, what would you point to?
I would get nervous because if you asked me to prove it, I don't know that I would quite know how.
Yeah, I'm fine with conjecture with this question.
Yeah, the speculative answer is the can-do attitude, the start over, the energy, the open market of imagination and ideas, the adventure of the gold rush. All that has been seeded in the international imagination as a definition of California. And that's why the Silicon Valley is often the second gold rush or the third gold rush, because it's a place where you could let your imagination and your ambitions to become very wealthy run wild. So I think that's residually powerful about the gold rush in the national and international imagination.
Let's say you met someone from, I don't know, Sweden, and they showed up to California and said, I'm trying to understand California, but I'm not really a nonfiction person. Is there a novel you'd recommend to help me or something fiction related to understand California? What would you give them?
The novelist Lisa See has written brilliantly about Chinese and Chinese Americans who are modeled in some respects after her own family. And she writes novels about that. And that's a really intricate portrait of a certain ethnicity in California history across generations.
Mm-hmm.
There's a good one, or a good set of them. She's written many.
Would you be more prone to give them a Steinbeck or a Kerouac?
I guess I would say read several Steinbecks.
Okay.
I guess I would say In Dubious Battle, Grapes of Wrath, Cannery Row, and then read Steinbeck's letters that he's writing to his editor, which are published, about trying to, as he say, write history while it's happening, which is a fascinating notion for a novelist. And so that kind of grassroots sensibility of the excitement of change in California during the 1930s, I would say Steinbeck's fallen off the canon, I think. I don't know that people continue to read that much Steinbeck, but I wouldn't throw that baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, I'm actually that's what I'm doing this year as I'm reading through his major novels and doing a podcast interview for each novel. And I just finished reading The Pastures of Heaven, which
Yeah.
for me is one of the most accurate snapshots of small town California life that I've read.
Yeah.
And I know it's demeaned as being sentimental. For someone that lives in the rural small part of California, I can attest to its veracity and its
Yeah.
descriptions.
Yeah. And I would say, just speaking to where you're coming from, William Saroyan.
Mm-hmm.
Keep reading William Saroyan. He knew what he was doing.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I mean,
I love his like little My Name is Elam, his tales of kids wandering barefoot through valley roads to get
yeah,
ice cream. And anyway, we could talk about fiction forever.
yep.
Let's jump to water. I really enjoyed your book on water in Los Angeles. What would you say is your biggest point of departure from someone like Donald Worster's view and vision of water history?
Don Worster has a set of intellectual chops that I don't have. That kind of breadth of both theoretical training and imagination, as well as the phenomenally well-researched argument in Rivers of Empire, for instance. And so that broad brush about technocratic power around the issue of gathering up, saving, and moving water is a big picture and a big picture argument. Water in Los Angeles is a narrow, I think, important investigatory historical argument about understanding Southern California by way of the intricate system of at least three watersheds. Because usually it's chopped up and people don't recognize that actually the LA River, the Colorado River, and the Owens River are fundamental to the growth of Southern California and related in the ways in which the city and private entities masterminded the movement of that water. So putting it all together, but without the sort of deep and energetic and kind of ferocious argument in Worster.
Yeah. I was just driving through Los Angeles during this most recent atmospheric river. It's always fun to drive 40 miles an hour on the 5. But one of the things that I observed as I was going along was the LA River, in quotation marks, full of water, which is an unusual occurrence for those who don't live here. What do you think has been the biggest impact for the LA basin in terms of taming, in quotation marks, the LA River? Like, what has it done to the region?
The biggest impact, I guess, is to, for reasons better and worse, inhibit flooding. It has worked in that way. The floods of the latter 19th and early 20th century were ferocious. So corralling that river in a concrete strait wasn't at all environmentally sensitive, and nor was it very cognizant of the preciousness of precipitation. The idea was get the water in the channel and run it out to the ocean. Well, we don't really think that way anymore because that's a precious resource. So that unintended consequence of rushing water out to sea when you're in an arid environment and then deciding that at virtually the same time, we'll just say goodbye to that river and we'll go get another one. So go up to the Owens Valley, for instance, or in the late 1920s, go to the Colorado Basin or Colorado watershed and get that one. And so all those impacts about profligacy and engineering and in many respects safety, yes, but we wouldn't tackle it that way now. We would figure out a little bit different ways, or actually significantly different ways, to handle the threat and also work to save some of that water.
Yeah. When I interviewed Donald Worster about Rivers of Empire, we talked about how rivers always find a way. And he was convinced that after we're gone, the rivers will return and they'll always be there. And I experienced that firsthand in watching Tulare Lake reemerge a few years ago, and how no matter what we think we can control, water in the end will win.
Yeah, and nature will. So Los Angeles, for instance, greater Southern California, came of age very successfully by essentially arguing implicitly and explicitly that we, the residents of Southern California, control nature. We can move it around, we can go get a river, we can channel a river, we can build wherever we want. And that's not true.
Last question on water. There's been a lot of interesting discussions about it in the aftermath of the fires in Los Angeles about who controls the water. And as someone that spent some time in Bakersfield in childhood, the wonderful company and the Resnicks, I grew up understanding that they really were the ones that hold the keys to the water. But I find it interesting that LA would criticize in some ways as people that went out and procured water and brought it to a desert. But it feels like, what's your kind of perception on this kind of ongoing discussion and argument about who controls water?
That's an easy one for me as an historian, which is that people don't pay enough attention to the history. So we're amnesic about these things. We don't acknowledge the historical antecedents to a lot of what we're doing. And yeah, the wonderful company, but also the Boswells and also Miller and Lux. And there are these layered histories about this. And the movement and control of water is power. There's no question. It's fiscal power, it's all kinds of power. And we're not making any more water. And I think just becoming cognizant of that, as I urge my students and neighbors and everyone to be more cognizant of fire, it will only serve us well to pay more attention. And as part of that paying attention, history's got to be at the table, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. Let's talk about railroads. Your book on railroads in California is one of my favorites. And I enjoyed digesting that as I started to think about the history and impact of railroads in California. That, along with Richard Wright's book, Railroaded, have been two of the most important for me. Because sometimes I feel that railroads are old hat for people. They don't look at it as a major technological innovation. Is there something you could compare it to, some modern day innovation like the internet or something that like connected people so thoroughly that would sit for people in importance?
Yeah. First of all, thanks for mentioning me in the same sentence as Richard White. I feel like, in terms of railroad scholarship, a junior varsity player to a varsity athlete. And yeah, I think the internet's a reasonable comparison. They're 100 years apart. The internet, when it was launched, was said to float all boats, tie us together, change the conceptions of time and space, be a technological force for equity and everything good. And the railroad was celebrated in the same way. There's a slight difference. I think the railroad was also expected to, in many a camp, provoke the second coming, literally. I don't think the internet has been graced with that kind of expectation. And then what happens in both cases is that it can't do everything it's promised to do. It just can't. And so the imposition of the railroad, what's different about it, I think, is railroad imposition into 19th century American life, folkways, perceptions, culture, was jarring because there was machinery in that period, but it's behind the walls of a factory. It's on a steamship. The railroad's everywhere. It's running through your town. You can hear it, you can see it, you can smell it. It's powerful, it's loud. So that's very jarring. The internet was jarring in its own way, but by then we have jet travel and high performance automobiles and everything else. The railroad's distinctive in that way.
Okay. One of the things I speculate about, and I wonder, and I'm talking about this in light of how difficult it has been to get a high-speed rail to connect the Bay Area and Los Angeles. And when I read about the corruption, the kickbacks, the lobbying, all the malfeasance that was going on in the railroad time, I wonder, do you think without that, the railroads would have gotten built? Without all the money flying around and the mixed motives?
Good question. No, probably not. Probably
What does
not.
that tell us about infrastructure? There's so many corollaries with that answer, right? What does that tell us?
Just to think about the allegory of water and gravity, water flows downhill, water will find its way, rivers will find their way, corruption will find its way when there's massive amounts of money at stake, public or private. And the bird dogging of public laws and citizen oversight has to be profound. And in the 19th century, it's not particularly profound. So I do think it says a lot. Yeah, that's an area of scholarship that would be great. There's investigative journalism about these issues, but I think having a scholar go back in history and find some parallels across time in infrastructural growth and the propensity towards corruption is probably a very good idea, because I think we in California, we oftentimes know when particularly high-ranking political figures fall because of corruption. We don't really know about the next levels where it's all quietly done, and I think that's probably out there to be discovered.
Yeah. I think some people tend to look at the Central Valley and think that the 99 freeway kind of charted the course of all this development, but it wasn't. It was the Central Pacific.
Yeah.
How do you think California's Central Valley would have developed without that major rail line running down the? It would have just been frontier, you imagine?
Yeah, but not for very long, I don't think. I think it would just be delayed. I think that agricultural breadbasket-y phenomenon of the Central Valley would have taken hold and root. It's just the railroad accelerates it, no question, by lines, transit lines to market and that kind of thing, and to provoke settlement in a very ambitious way. So I think it might be a generation later. I don't know, it's hard to speculate, but I think it would have happened.
Yeah, it's interesting just writing about the history of where I live, Fresno, and understanding really there was this kind of bipolar. You have this Fresno area here with the Fresno station that emerges, and then you also have the Sierra Nevada regions, which were emerged from the gold rush. And so it almost feels like it's a transition point, a major kind of inflection point when you move from the foothills to the valley, and the railroad is what charted that, if you will.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about legacy, because the big four have a very mixed legacy. How should we think about them in the long-term development of the state? They obviously help to connect East and West, but then there's also a bunch of other things that went along with collateral damage, if you will, that went along with that. How should we look at their legacy?
I don't think I could come up with anything particularly sophisticated beyond what you just suggested, which is it's mixed. It's mixed. The kind of pedestaling of the big four as titans of industry, ushering the modernism of California, et cetera. Okay, but these are human beings. They have foibles. They're ruthless. At least some of them are particularly ruthless. They're not especially honest. They live checkered lives. So yeah, and I guess it just doesn't make sense to me to make them into heroic figures beyond the usual human foibles of anyone.
Mm. Let's transition for a moment. This is a sidebar. I want to talk about Yosemite for a second. What's your favorite art associated with Yosemite, or type of artwork, medium?
Not a student of them, but I certainly admire indigenous basketry from that part of the Sierra. I find it compellingly beautiful. So that would be one answer.
Can you talk about that a little bit more? Because I think some people would go, be in a museum and they see a couple baskets and they'd move because of kind of our Western preferences over to the oil paintings and the canvases. What should we look for when we're looking at a basket?
Well, I think it requires a little, or not so much a little, maybe a lot of study and understanding of the intricacy of those cultures that produce those baskets. So the material, the division of labor between men and women, the symbology, et cetera. And I'm not a student of it. I know some people who are, and it's far more intricate than, oh, that's a pretty basket. And so I admire that very much. Photography, those big cameras with big tripods, the Carlton Watkins, et cetera, era of Yosemite photography is remarkably beautiful to me. I'm not so much a big fan of the vast oil landscapes of Yosemite or of the Sierra or of the Rockies. I find them a little too grandiose.
Yeah.
They're impressive.
Yeah.
But I guess I would say give me baskets and Carlton Watkins photography and I'm doing okay.
Yeah. My favorite's Obata. I love his kind of Japanese minimalism, impressionistic, just it's almost like a transcendentalism.
No question. I also like, as cameras get smaller and people take them on their trips to the new national park, I like the candids and I like the, here we are at the foot of El Cap and here we are in the floor, here we are wherever, Tuolumne, et cetera. I like those candids from 1910 to 1980.
Yeah. I've asked an array of guests this question. I'm curious your thoughts. A few years ago, there was a proposal to return national parks to indigenous control. What do you think about that?
As a provocative statement about land theft, I'm really taken by it. The practicality of it is, of course, challenging. For many of those indigenous groups that did have land that has become national parks, they're either maybe not confederated any longer or they're gone. So that raises, but the people who propose this, they know that. They know that. It's not like they haven't thought it through. I think it's a remarkably interesting notion. because the national parks were celebrated as primitive nature, empty of humans, let's save them. No, I don't think it'll happen in my lifetime, but we have seen some land return in the American West. It is a fascinating idea. There's just a long way between here and there.
Okay. Let's talk about a little bit about progressivism. It has a huge impact on the history of the state. It created an interesting prototype of direct democracy. How do you think that progressive vision for the referendum system? How do you think that's held up? Do you think it's what do you think? Yeah. So if the progressives of the 1910s and 20s saw what it became, what would they think?
They'd hate it because it's been captured. It's been captured. So the notion, it was a pretty clever notion, pretty interesting notion about direct democracy through these vehicles, initiative, referendum, and recall. But initiatives, referendums, propositions, that world has been largely captured by big entities who can get the signatures, put things on the ballot, push the PR campaign, spend a lot of money. And that's not what the progressives had in mind. They wanted those tools in the hands of men and then eventually women who had the power of voting and could express their democratic ideals that way.
Okay. One of the unfortunate associations of progressivism was also the history of eugenics and that whole world. Can you connect those two dots for people? I don't know if people tend to see those things as deeply connected.
Yeah. What I would say is that a fairly simple way to understand progressivism, but I think it holds up, is that they are obsessed with hygiene. And that obsession is let's make everything clean. Clean government, clean drugs, clean food, clean streets, clean houses, clean bloodstreams. It all fits under this hygienic obsession about essentially the dirt of the early 20th century. And they just extended that vision into the bodies and bloodstreams of people that they found not clean. And eugenics is right there to be where they want, a lot of them want to put their energies.
Yeah. One of the things you do in your book on progressivism is you challenge this notion of top down, which I think I fall victim to that as well, because I tend to look at legislation, major kind of national reform efforts, but you see it as more complicated than that. Why is this top down model that I've associated for a long time with progressivism wrong in your mind?
I don't think it's wrong. I just think there's more to it than that. And I guess in some respects, what I would lean to is the power of journalists. And so journalists who were progressive muckrakers for smaller and larger journalistic entities were exceedingly important to the rise of the movement and the spread of the ideology, if you will. So not just political actors, not just Sacramento, for instance. I think that's really important. And then I think neighborhoods, everyday people, saw the need for a change, whether it was we need cleaner streets, we need more railroad safety. That's a progressive plank because the railroad killed my paperboy. So there's that kind of thing too.
Let's jump to your most recent book, which was a lot of fun to read. Is it Fiscus? Am I saying that correct?
Yeah.
Because I just read it. I never heard it.
Yeah.
Obviously, this came to mind as soon as I started reading. One of my favorite Billy Wilder movies is Ace in the Hole. Is that directly related to this?
It's pretty clear that Billy Wilder was fascinated by the Kathy Fiscus phenomenon. And so in at least two of his movies, there are references to Fiscus-like things. Ace in the Hole is also tied to an earlier issue of somebody in harm's way underground, which is the spelunker who went into a cave and got stuck, died in there. And there was a lot of hullabaloo about trying to get him out. That event, which is in the late 20s, if I'm not mistaken, helped to energize radio. They lowered a kind of live radio audio to him. I think they talked to him, if I'm not mistaken. And the Fiscus event has the same kind of impact, or even more so, on live television. But Billy Wilder was clearly fascinated by these events of drama, tragedy, crowds, and he picked it up cinematically.
Yeah. Can you give just a brief sketch of what happened? And then I have a few questions about it.
Sure. So in the spring of 1949, just a couple miles from where I'm speaking to you right now, a little 3-year-old girl fell into an abandoned well that the cap had fallen off or been knocked off, and she fell deep into the earth, into an abandoned well casing. The irony is that her father was the superintendent of that field for the local water company, and her fate was unknown. She was alive, Her fate was unknown for about 48 hours, where a fevered rescue attempt was launched. How are we going to get this little girl out of there? All kinds of attempts or ideas were floated, some of them completely insane, and others of them part of the heroism of the effort to try to get her down, get her up. She died in there, and they got her, but she had died. Live television comes as an experiment to film live and broadcast to a receiving tower up that had been built recently up on the San Gabriel Mountains, not far from where the fires just burned, and try to do live remote television. And it worked. So that inaugurates live action remote TV in world technological culture.
Yeah, that's one of the most fascinating things. When I lived in Los Angeles, admittedly, I was a grad student, and there were many a night where I would be sitting on a couch with my roommates with a couple beers, and we were watching a live chase on KCAL 9.
This is the origin.
Yeah, so you would connect those two things. So
this
is bigger than news for you, right? This is reality television as well. Can you, because that feels like more of a step to me. Can you connect those things for me?
Oh, just simply that people, so if you think about reality television and its real-time action, and also the emotional qualities and quantities of live reality television, that people feel invested in the lives of those that they're watching, they get to know them or think they do. I think all those things are true in the Fiscus event because it was on for 24 hours. People were glued to it. There weren't very many televisions back then. They were sold at appliance stores, and the appliance store people who had them in greater LA turned them on and turned them out to the windows, or probably had them facing the windows anyway. And people lined up on the sidewalks to watch this rescue attempt. And I do think it's got a reality television sort of tension or connection between the audience, but you're sitting on the couch watching police chases. This is the origin of that. This is happening. That's true crime-ish. Fiscus is not that, but it's tragedy, drama, human condition. It's all that.
Yeah, Hollywood right there.
Yeah.
We close these podcasts with book recommendations, which I suspect you and I could probably talk about this for a while. I would love for you to really flesh out some important books and maybe some new interesting books. So maybe if someone wants to really dig in deep to California history, and then what on the publishing horizon that gets you excited?
There's a great new book by Matt Lasseter on the drug war, the war against drugs, that is really centered in California suburbia in the Cold War period. And it's about white kids and not African American kids. And it's thoroughly researched and really smart. There is a beautiful book on suburban Southern California growth, and it's about the demography of Southern California across census periods. So when does the San Gabriel Valley move from white to Chinese and Chinese American or Asian, Pan-Asian? And how many people constitute that movement from 1970 to 80 to 90, et cetera? Very thoroughly researched book. There's a new book, which I have to admit I haven't read yet, which is about Oakland, called The Pacific Circuit, which is about Oakland as a way to understand industrialization, deindustrialization, the fate and future of California and its place in the world by looking at Oakland. Oftentimes is in the shadow of, if not the East Bay, certainly San Francisco. And it makes sense to me to study a place like Oakland very carefully in the contemporary world. So that's an exciting book for me. My own graduate students, this is the Western side of things. One of my own graduate students just published a book, Sarah Kai has just published a reimagination of the Overland Trail, of which California was the prime destination, and looks at the Overland Trail phenomenon of the mid-19th century, the pre-Civil War period, through the lens of burial and the notion that the overlanders, as they move through the Great Basin, the Rockies, up and over into California or Oregon, as they lose people, grandma dies, whatever, and they bury them. They're burying them in non-US territory. Not, a lot of that US territory, it hasn't become US yet, or at least a lot of it prior to the Mexican-American War. And she writes that this practice of burials is about claiming the land. And the indigenous people are saying, no, we bury our people there, it's our land. And so she's got this new lens, which is fascinating, on basically manifest destiny claims to territory.
Interesting. I get all sorts of emails from listeners, and I got an interesting one a couple of weeks ago, and the person was asking what I perceive to be the value of going back and reading through a lot of the Bancroft stuff about the history of California. Well, how would you answer that email if someone asked you?
Bancroft had a great ability to amass the primary sources. And so we're in his debt for that. That became the founding documents of the Bancroft Library. So the primary source attention to the Mexican and Spanish periods, unusual for his period. And so we owe him a lot for that. The interviews are important. They're oral histories, they're important. We can go through them again with a different lens. Bancroft had a certain kind of perception of things. We largely don't think the same way these days, but the raw material that became Bancroft's histories that he or his big team wrote, that raw material is gold.
Fantastic. The last question for you, Bill. What are you working on next?
A dear friend of mine and I have a collection of essays called Southland that we've commissioned and worked with journalists and scholars, which is all about LA County, taking the county seriously as the jurisdiction instead of the vague reflection of greater Southern California, greater LA. We're going to actually say, here's the county, and it's basically a city state or a nation state. And it's really important to take it on its own terms. So there's 24 essays or so by these brilliant writers and scholars about this or that aspect of the county, its past, its present, and its future, accompanied by original, and that'll be out in a year from the University of Chicago Press.
What for you is the most underrated city out in the greater LA County? I remember when I moved from Pasadena.
Every one of them but LA?
Yeah, I moved from Pasadena out to the Laverne area. I was teaching in Claremont at the time.
Yeah.
And a lot of my friends on the west side referred to me as moving to Arizona. That's what they said, which I took as a direct insult, which I think
it is insulting. Yeah.
But I loved Claremont. I even loved going all the way out to San Bernardino and getting incredible Mexican food.
Oh, yeah.
Like if a tourist comes to LA, it's unlikely they're going to take their a rental car out to San Bernardino, but what part of the LA County should they visit if they just traveling to LA?
Well, I'm with you. I would say East County. There's a way in which in Chino and the Chino Hills, you can see the past a little bit more clearly than in other places that are so developed. So Diamond Bar, San Dimas, Chino, those are really interesting places for people like us who can look for the past in the present. It's all underrated, except for Santa Monica and LA.
Yeah. Bill, this has been so much fun. I would encourage people just to go look for you on Amazon or bookshop.org and just look at the past history of publications, and you really can't go wrong. And definitely pick up the newest book. I think if you have any interest in celebrity culture, reality TV, all of that stuff, and the origins of that, I think it really can be charted back to a little girl falling down in a ravine.
Yeah, I had to write that book to just exercise the hold it had on me. Just obsessed by it. So thank you so much. It's been a really lively conversation. I'm really grateful.
Thanks for listening, everyone. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider supporting us by either giving us a rating and review or by making a financial contribution at our Patreon page, which is www.patreon.com/History of California. We'll see you next time. Thank you.